You can use them and start using them just like regular colored pencils. So kind of shading a little darker along the edges, lightening up your pressure towards the middle. And they'll begin by looking like regular colored pencils. The neat thing is it's like a controlled way of adding watercolor, because watercolor can be a little bit unpredictable, kind of has a mind of its own. So that's why some people tend to not like watercolor. So watercolor pencils is just a little bit more controlled, specific way of adding the quality of watercolor, but in a little bit more of a controlled way. So I'm just using a little bit of green. I'm blending a little bit of the lighter green. And we don't see a whole lot of difference right now, but when I add the water to it, which is actually really tempting to add in a little too soon, so try to complete one whole object before you grab your paintbrush and your water, because once your paper's wet, it really doesn't give the ability to continue working if your paper's damp or wet. So do a complete object with your watercolor pencils, and then if you want to add more watercolor pencil, you can let it dry and then build more on top of it. So I'm just adding some yellow towards the middle to give it that feeling of form. So I'm making my colors a little darker towards the edges, kind of thinking about shadow, thinking about making it feel 3D. So I've got my darkest green towards the side, my lighter green kind of as a medium area, and then my yellow towards the center. So we can add highlights here by keeping an area completely white. You just have to be really careful when you're adding the water to make sure that you're painting around it slowly so it doesn't fill in. So there's no way of erasing this once you add it, but you can continue building up those colors. I'm not going to do this whole object because that would take too long. I'm just going to show you this one wing in the body here in just a second. So the nice thing about this is you can be a little bit messy. It doesn't have to be perfect when you are coloring. But you do have to be a little bit careful and slow when you actually add the water. We can't just paint over top of this whole section because everything would just blend together. So you have to be kind of particular about how you blend and washing off your brush just like you would if you were using regular watercolor paints. So if you do a dark area, wash off your brush before you move into a lighter area because it will pull that color into it. I'm gonna make that a little darker because it's behind the body. Thinking about my light source, I think it's coming from that way, so I'm just gonna add a little bit of shadow on the right side of everything, and then I'll show you how to blend it. I'm just adding a little bit more of that dark green along the right edge of all my stuff. Okay, let me show you how to move that color around now. So I grabbed a few different sizes of brushes. I've got a big brush, I've got medium, small, and then I have this pointy one. I actually prefer using this round pointy brush for blending the watercolor pencils because when I get it wet, I have the most control because I can just use the tippy top of it in small areas, and then I can push a little bit harder if I want a larger space for blending. So I'm just gonna get it a little bit wet, kind of wipe off that excess water so it's damp, it's not dripping. And then, let me zoom in a little bit here so you guys can see. And we just wanna work in small areas. So you can see as I touch that wet brush to the watercolor pencil, it wakes up and becomes blendable. And I just kind of want to work slowly with it. If I've got a wet area and I don't want it to blend with its next door area here, then I'm going to let it dry for a second and come back to it because I want that to be lighter than this. So I'm going to come back to that area in a second. If we get a lot of pigment on our brush, just rinsing it off like we would if we were using regular watercolor paint, and then continuing to blend. Since I want this little area in the center a little bit lighter, I want this area along the side to be darker. So it's kind of like if you've used watercolor before, you use it in layers. So you might put down like a base layer of really watered down green and then let it dry and then add in a little bit darker green along the edges and then let that dry and then add in a little bit of yellow towards the middle. This is kind of like doing all the layers, a lot of it at once, and not having to go back and build up layers so much. But you can, you just have to let it dry between. So you can see, depending on how much pigment I put, see how I put more green over here and less over here, but it's the same color. But see how this is more see-through, it's lighter there because I put less pigment, I colored less. So you actually don't want to push as hard as you can with these because it'll give you a lot of color, like too much, then you won't even have any space to put it. So you'll just have to end up removing it from the paper. So you want to have a light hand when you're using these. Otherwise, you'll end up with way too much pigment, way too much color. Now I'm going to come into that little area that I let dry and make sure that I'm blending it separate from the arm so it creates kind of like a little shadow there. So you don't want to use too large of a brush because you'll lose control over where the colors are going to go. This wet brush is just to kind of tell the colors how to blend and where to go. Does that make sense? So if you use just a little bit of water and a small brush is the best for adding the water to your watercolor pencils. If this is something you guys want to use, feel free to come over and grab a couple. I only have one pack today, but if a lot of people seem interested, I can bring another pack over or a few more packs tomorrow. But feel free to come and grab some of these if you'd like to use them. I just have them laying out over here, and you are welcome to them. Any questions about the watercolor pencil? Pretty self-explanatory now that you've seen it. How many people have used these before? Couple, not very many. Okay, they're really fun. It's one of my favorites. So feel free to use these today. I have them right over here and you're welcome to them. All right, markers. I showed you a bit with markers before, but I'll show you a bit more. So the watercolor markers, these only work with the washable Crayolas. And we can do a very similar process to the watercolor pencil. And actually, before I show you that, I'm just gonna paint my little penguin's head just with the base color here. I'm gonna do a little bit of purple. So I'm gonna take a little bit of regular watercolor paint. And it's tricky to use it straight out of the palette, so I always add it to a watercolor palette, and then I can control how dark or light it is by how much water I add to it. And I want this to be pretty watered down for that first layer, so I'm just gonna take a little bit of that purple and just do a base color on my penguin here while he's drying. I'll show you the markers, and then I'll come back over here and show you a little bit more with watercolor paint. So with watercolor paint, we work in layers, so that's why I'm doing this and letting it dry while I show you the other thing. So I'm just doing a nice watered down layer of purple, and then I'll show you how that works in a minute. When we're using watercolor paint, we never want it to be like sticky and thick. That's not how watercolor paint is intended to be used. It should show the white of the paper, and how much white of the paper showing through gives you the dark or light of that color. So you can see I can control that pigment with how little or how much water I add to it. Okay, I'll just let that guy dry for a second while I show you some marker here. So I'm just gonna use a little bit of turquoise. And this is very similar, for the process of it, it's very similar to the watercolor pencils. It's just a little bit more intense with the color. You'll see in a second here. Guys, whoever has something with audio playing, can you turn that off, please?
That's not in our class.
Oh, is it just down the hall?
Yeah.
Thanks for helping me here. My ears are not accurate. Thanks for explaining that. The way I hear things is very strange because I have hearing issues because of my ears, my issues with my ears. So I can't tell exactly where sounds are coming from. Very weird. It's a weird thing to not be able to do. So I'm just building up a little bit of color and it looks kind of scribbly and weird right now, but you'll see it in a second here. So depending on how much pigment I put on my paper, that's going to control how dark it gets. But I can layer colors just like I would with regular watercolors or the watercolor pencils. So if I want it to be a little darker, I'll put a little bit of that dark blue. Okay, let me zoom into my little froggy here and I'll show you how that works when we add water to it. So I'm using that same brush, that round brush, so I can control how much water. And you can see it leaves some of my lines, so I have to be kind of careful about how I put those lines down, as opposed to my watercolor pencil ends up being a little bit more smooth when I add that water to it. But this could create kind of an interesting quality if you like that effect. And the more you work with it, with a little bit of water, the more you can kind of move it around. So if you're a little bit more intentional with how you put your lines down on your paper, you could create kind of a design with your lines, with your color, and then just soften them with the water. This would have to be done in a little bit of layers, so like the first layer, and then you can add in a little bit more and do a second layer, or you can even layer on top of it with the watercolor pencil or the regular watercolor. This could be kind of a cool base layer or a top layer. Add in a little bit of an outline and then soften it with water. So you can see it just kind of moves that color around and helps it blend. All right, let's go back to my penguin here. Now that that's dry, we can build up a little bit more on top of it. So I'm just going to take a little bit of blue and a little bit of black into my watercolor palette. I've got my blue, take a little bit of black, and I'm just gonna open the photo so I can look at it while I'm working. So I can see where those highlights are. So I wanna leave the center of that face a little lighter here. So I'm going to create that shape by going around it. We want the side of the face to be a little darker because that's where the shadows are. With watercolor paint, you can do a couple of cool things. So right now I'm just using it kind of more traditionally. I'm going to show you how to use kind of a wet on wet approach that gives you a little bit more creativity and freedom with it, but it doesn't have nearly as much control, so I'll show you that in just a second. And again, I'm just controlling how light this is by how much water I'm adding to it. So if it gets too dark, quickly add some water to it and it will lighten up. And you can see it's an interesting way of adding some shadow. Take a little bit of blue here, mix it in. Then I don't want to overwork it. That's the tendency with watercolor paint, is to keep blending and keep blending, and it creates this weird texture on your paper where your paper is almost like falling apart. It gets like these little rough spots that you have to wait for them to dry and then try to almost sand them off. It's a huge pain, so you've got to be really careful. The tendency people want to do is just keep working it, so don't do that. Once it looks pretty good, just let it be and then see how it dries, because sometimes it dries a little different than it starts off. So I could do a little bit more shading here. And then if I don't want that to dry with a weird edge here, see how it's kind of a zigzag edge, I'm just gonna take a damp, clean brush, lift up some of that color and help it to soften that edge. And then I'll just let that dry and see how it looks once it starts to dry and see where I want to continue to add more layers to it. So this is a little bit more of a layered approach. You've got to work a little, let it dry, work in another area, come back to it, continue building it up. Make sure you don't leave any edges of a hard line and let those dry like that. Make sure you always kind of soften the edge as you work so that you're not struggling with trying to remove those weird lines later.